So let's make a shirt today. And here's our pattern. What do we got? We have our front part that has our placket now. And then we have the yoke and the lower back piece. Then we have our sleeve and all the little details. So the cuff, the collar, and also this little piece for the placket. Normally we would interface some of these smaller details, especially the cuffs and of course the collar. But I don't have interfacing at hand right now, and I'm actually okay to make it without interfacing. This is now without interfacing, and sometimes at the collar you can see it's a little bit see-through and we can see the seam allowance. But at the same time it's also like even lighter, and for the hot weather right now I think it's perfect. So how do we cut our pieces now from the fabric? And I've prepared this little graphic here, which kind of shows a little bit how we could possibly place them onto our fabric. And keep in mind, the fabric is folded. So some parts like the yoke or the collar, but also the lower back piece are on fold. And one thing I also wanted to mention is that traditionally the yoke would be cut on a bias grain. It would add a little bit more comfort here, but it also wastes a lot of fabric. And kind of a minimal waist cut is a good idea. So push your pieces as close together as possible to prevent waste. Generally speaking, I like to prepare the separate pieces. I like to finish the separate pieces, let's say the back, the front, and the sleeves, and also little details. I like to finish them first, so then in the end it's just a question of assembling them. And it's a question of assembling them in a smart and logical way. So first things first, let's start with the back. So what do we have to do? We have to create the pleat, and we have to stitch the yoke to the pleated lower part of the pattern. And don't forget, we have 2 yoke pieces, and it's basically like one on the outside and one on the inside. It's sort of a lining, and that's kind of also how we are going to stitch it. So let's do that now.
And I've already fixed the pleat on the back and pinned the 2 yoke pieces to the lower back piece. One is under and one is on top. So now we're gonna stitch that real quick, and this is how that looks like. This is the inside.
And once we've stitched everything together, we are also going to stitch a very thin and narrow top stitch along the edge. It is optional, but I really like it. If you don't want it, you can also just scrap it.
So I've already done the top stitch here. It's super close to the edge and looks very nice.
Voila, the back is done. Now let's have a look at the front. And what do we have to do here? Basically, just pleat these pieces. And then we can either put buttons and buttonholes, or we leave it as is, and I have added little snap buttons later. You can also do that at this point right now, but snap buttons are simple enough to stitch them onto like the finished shirt. For real buttons with buttonholes, I recommend to do it once you have folded the placket here.
So I've already prepared the folding part a bit. Basically now I'm ironing the seam allowance towards the inside, and the other fold would be 1 cm of center front. So then we have the 2 cm facing, 1 cm seam allowance. We do that to both sides, and then let's match that. Beautiful. It's very thin and I like it this way.
So now it's time for something really new. We haven't done anything like it before, and that is the sleeve placket. So how does that work? The piece has a bit of a weird shape, and you need that piece twice, and also the sleeve twice. Optionally, you could quite possibly put interfacing on this piece, and or on the part on the sleeve where we are going to slash it. But this is just kind of to make it all a little bit stiffer. It works just as fine without interfacing.
Let's go back to the machine. And I've pinned now this little placket piece under the sleeve, and I'm gonna stitch the box around this 11 centimeter line that I have marked. This is how it is kind of similar to a welted pocket, and leave the needle at the end inside of the fabric, a few more stitches, leave the needle inside, lift the footer, and then turn your piece. This is how we get clean edges. And now I can slash right through both of the pieces, and I stop 1 cm before the top, and I go into the corners like this. And now I've turned the sleeve with the right side facing up now, and I flipped that piece through the slash. And now back to the ironing board, and I'm gonna do it nicely. So I'm ironing it from both sides, and now this is the right side facing up, and I pull the piece through the slash. I'm ironing the seam allowance towards the inside on both sides, towards the stitched on piece, and now I want to start folding the under wrap, which is the smaller side, the right side. Make the top a little bit flat and check if it's been cut all the way to the corner there. So I fold 1 cm seam allowance first, and then I match this folded line to the line I stitched underneath. So now I've basically closed this gap. See? So I flatten this seam and make it nice, and now I want to fold that to match exactly the same line again, and I fold the seam allowance in, and then I match that to this seam, and then it matches to the other side too, and it covers everything very nicely. Now I iron that very flat, and I want it to be very crisp, because now I need to fold the top bit into shape, and it's supposed to be like this kind of half roof, like a little triangle, and it needs a lot of wiggling to be nice and neat, but with a bit of patience and a bit of figuring it out, there you go, I managed to flatten that as well and get it very nice and crisp, and this is what I want. So now it's all been ironed into place. I can move over to the sewing machine, and again, same as ironing, I start with the under wrap, and I want to now top stitch everything together there. So I top stitch along the folded edge, and I basically just let my footer glide alongside the edge, so I get this very thin top stitch. I did the same thing with the yoke. And now I'm going to the other side, and I'm also stitching it down on that fold, but make sure that you don't stitch the under wrap at the same time. And I go all the way up now, and I leave the needle in. I twist my piece, and then I continue to stitch, a couple of stitches, I leave the needle in, and again now just a couple of stitches to stitch the overlap to the under wrap on the top part there. It's maybe 2 cm. You could do another stitch there, kind of crossing back over to make everything very secure. I left it a little bit open there. There's a possibility that it can unravel on the inside, but I really love the clean look of this. Like, as little top stitches as possible, that's what I actually like. So I had already pre-folded the pleat there. Don't forget kind of the leftover between the cuff measurement on the sleeve and our actual cuff is what we have left over for pleats. And mine are a little bit different, but I think they look quite cute. And I've done it to both sides. Now the sleeves are ready, and I can put them aside because it is time to attach the front and the back.
And now again, we have to attach the front to this yoke piece, and that has 2 layers. So we are going to stitch it to the outside part first. Then we can fold the seam allowance towards the yoke, and then on the other piece of the yoke, the one that we haven't stitched yet, we will already kind of pre-iron the seam allowance. We can pin it on the back of the first seam and then top stitch it, so it's all nice and neat.
Unfortunately, my camera stopped filming when I did this shoulder seam, so I try to simulate that real quick. I have on my left side a kind of double piece like the yoke, and then the other piece is just single. So I want to stitch it. Now imagine this is the outer part of the yoke facing outside. I want to stitch that first to the front pieces. So imagine this is the first side of the shoulder, and then we do the second one. And now I fold the seam allowance towards the inside of the yoke, and I will iron that. And then I take the other piece and I fold 1 cm seam allowance also towards the inside of the yoke, maybe a little bit less, make it overlap the first seam, and then we have to pin that. So I've ironed it and pinned it nicely into place. Little trick, you can also glue that. Because we want to stitch it from the good side, so we are stitching a little bit blindly. And that is that.
So now that we've done the shoulder seam, we have the entire neckline at our disposal, so to say. So let's put the collar. But before we can put the collar, we have to prepare it. So, and while we're at it, let's prepare the collar and the cuffs at the same time. It's a little bit similar thing. So we gotta stitch them, we gotta cut them a little bit, and then we can flip and iron them. And we will leave the lower part open, and for the cuff, we will leave this part open. We will leave the part open that attaches to the sleeve. But this line here and also the outside line of the collar can already be prepared.
So let's start with the collar, and we're starting on either side, and we're going basically straight into that curve, like a few stitches. And you can see I'm going stitch by stitch, literally by hand, because I want it to be super nice around there. And then the long part just straight ahead, and then again a curve, and I'm going step by step, stitch by stitch, to get it as smooth as possible. So now let's continue and do the cuffs as well. The procedure is very similar. We're starting on one side, take this curve very slowly, keep it clean, keep it smooth, and then the length, another little curve, and we're done. Now there's just the second cuff left, and then it's time to iron them. So first things first, let's iron them as is, just the way we just stitch them to relax the seams. Now if we want to flip them, we have to either slash these round bits or cut them very short, because otherwise it folds very badly. And now I have cut the seam allowance very short along the curve, and it's very easy to fold it back like this. So I've ironed it as well, and now the cuffs are beautiful and also the collar ready to go.
So now it's time to grab the collar and we can stitch it to the body section. Since both sleeves are still separate and not yet attached to the body, it's quite convenient to put the collar because we don't have too much stuff dangling around, and it's kind of like easier and easy to handle. Let's do that now.
So I've already pinned one side of the collar to the neckline, and I've pinned right side on right side, and I'm gonna stitch it now from the other side so the collar piece is underneath side. Make sure that at the beginning and at the end you really match the folded edge of the placket, and then also make sure that you match all the little notches. So the shoulder notch is very important, but also kind of center back, for example, and this is where I have pinned it as well. And now I'm going very slowly, and you can see I don't see the collar piece, the collar is under. And also be aware that you don't stitch onto the other piece, just stitch the one. And we stitch, 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 and I unpin it at the same time until I come out on the other end. There you see, start exactly at the fold. And then we can put all the seam allowance into the collar, we can fold it into the collar, and that's what I want to do now at the ironing board. And at the same time now I also want to fold the seam allowance of the still unstitched piece to the inside. I had the collar already pre-ironed, so it's a little bit easier. Anyway, anyhow, also the notches are important again, match them. You can see the shoulder here. And now back to the machine. I have pressed it a little bit with the iron so it stays in place. And now again, I want to stitch it from the outside, so to say. So I can't really see the piece that I'm stitching, and I want to now either follow the shadow of the seam, or I do it like a top stitch, and I'm doing it like a top stitch. Actually, I haven't filmed it, but I'm doing a double top stitch. One that is just along the edge, and then another that is 0.5 cm. Just to keep the collar a little bit more standing up. Don't forget I didn't put interfacing. And quick check, and I like it. Very nice.
Done! So now it is time to finally stitch the sleeves into the armhole. And in order to do that like quick and conveniently, we want to pre-stitch the head with a line or two, and then we can gather it and fit it into the arms guide. The lower bits here don't need gathering, but like around here there's a lot of extra material, a lot of ease that we have to gather in. And in retrospect, I believe it's a little bit too much, and I will probably fold some of this ease out of the top of the head. Maybe a centimeter, maybe even two. It seems to be quite a lot. Anyway, we have to do that now, and once we've done that, we can stitch the sleeve into the arms guide. And in this case, many shirts you buy would have a flat felt seam. I was a little bit lazy. I just did a regular seam, and then I overlocked it, and then I top stitched it to kind of keep it all a little bit light around here.
So grab your two sleeves, and then what I've done, I've quickly folded them in half and took the middle of that. So I want to place my gathering stitch just in the two middle quarters, so to say, basically before the curve changes direction. And we do that to both sleeves. I'm just doing one row of stitches, that's plenty for this purpose. and then we grab either the top or the bottom thread. You can't mix them. Grab one of them and then pull. So I have gathered both sleeve heads and then I have pinned my sleeves into the arm sky, and it's time to stitch that now. Ideally the sleeve would be below and then the body would be on top, because the longer seam should always be down. And then we can stitch it step by step. Make sure that you're not catching any little pleats. Trust me, I've cut it out, I've done plenty. So we're stitching and stitching, and you can also see me kind of pulling it up. What that does is, like, since the longer part is facing downwards and the shorter part is upwards, if I roll it up like this, it kind of eases it into each other much better. And there I go. Number one is done, and now the second sleeve off camera.
So now that the sleeves have been put into the armhole, we would want to finally stitch our cuffs, but we need to finish the entire side seam first on both sides. And this one is a French seam. What does that mean? So we have the look of a regular open seam from this side, but actually on the inside you can see there is a really nice covered seam allowance here. We don't see any fray. So it's very beautiful and very nice for a shirt, especially because people like to roll shirts up, and I'm one of them. So once you have rolled it up, you don't have anything ugly here, you just have a nice French seam. So let's French seam the entire side, and we are going to stitch it with the seam allowance facing outside first. So we're stitching left side on left side, kind of like this, exactly like that, and then we flip our shirt and we stitch it again from the inside, so it is all neat and clean from the outside and on the inside as well.
Unfortunately, my camera had a bit of a problem again, so I missed filming the actual side seam of the shirt, but I have a little simulation here. So we want to do a French seam, and I have marked two lines. One is 0.5 and one is 1 centimeter. And the first round is left side on left side, so the right side of the fabric is facing out, and we're stitching that 0.5 or even a little bit less, 0.4 if you want. Now we have to press it and steam it very well to relax the seams, and then we want to kind of flip it now. And you can see I've stitched along that line, get rid of the lint, and then also match these edges. The seam allowance should be sandwiched between the two layers. And I'm going to flip it, steam it a little bit again, and back to the machine afterwards. Now, before I stitch it, I actually want to check that seam allowance again. So I'm also going to cut a little bit into that seam allowance. I'm going to cut a little bit off, and all kind of like threads or lint or whatever. The least I have there, the easier it is now to do the second stitch. So let's cut off a little bit more until it's all neat and clean. So now I want to fold that back in there, and then top stitch again at 0.5, maybe 0.6. We really don't want to catch anything in this seam, and once I'm done, I can go back to the ironing board and give it a good pressing and steaming again. As you can see, this fabric is a cotton linen mix or something, and it creases a lot, and it's very hard to iron actually. So once it's all relaxed and nice, we can check if we got any lint coming through there, any like anything from the seam allowance, but it looks good. Great. So this is how you do that. This will be on the inside of the shirt, this little welt, and then clean on the outside. And there we go.
So now it's time for the cuffs. Let me guide you step by step through the process. I have already pre-ironed the open edge of the cuff, so I know exactly where the 1 cm seam allowance is, and I have this kind of ironed edge there. So do that real quick and I will see you.
So let's attach the cuffs. First things first, we have to pin it. And same with the collar, pick a side, and we're gonna pin one side first. Unfold that seam allowance, and then I usually start with the beginning and the end, kind of like from the underwrap to the overlap, and then I arrange the pleats and everything else in between with pins. So I've done that real quick, cut it out, and now I want to stitch that first line. Be very neat at the beginning and the end to really hit kind of the closest point there, because it has to be very nice and even with our underwrap and overwrap for the sleeve placket, and here you can see what I mean. So we flip the seam allowance to the inside. It is pre-ironed, so I don't have to go iron it necessarily. And then I want to pin it real quick and then top stitch it all together. I'm gliding along the edge, and that gives me a very thin top stitch, maybe 1 millimeter off the edge. Now, one more cuff to go, and then we can take care of the hemline. Snip, snip.
The cuffs are done, and now the last thing that we want to do is the lovely... So, the last thing on the list is the hemline, and I've done this bias tape finish, which is fairly simple and quite nice in this case. I'm not a universal fan of bias taped finishes, but for this shirt I think it's a really nice alternative to just rolling the edge. And bias tape is very convenient to follow curvy shapes. So we're gonna stitch it to the right side, flip it in, iron it really nicely in shape, and then we can top stitch it in place. So that is the final step, and see you in a minute.
So I've grabbed some white bias tape, and now I'm unfolding one of the sides and I'm aligning that to the seam allowance of my shirt, and I'm doing kind of right side on right side, stitching it on the outside there. And then we want to stitch it seam allowance and seam allowance there. It's 0.5 cm actually, so I'm making my shirt a little bit longer. And this is like kind of one of these pieces. I'm not going continuously around, I'm always stopping because I have kind of a little bit of a slit moment on the side, and I want to keep it like that. And once we've done every single edge, we can now iron it in shape and then top stitch it. I'm not showing the top stitching part, just kind of iron it first flat like this, and then fold the seam allowance towards the bias tape and fold the whole thing on the inside like this, roll it in, pin it maybe, and use the iron to really kind of shape and form the bias tape. So we just iron all the bias tape, fold it to the inside, and then we can clean it all up and top stitch it. So I've already done it. There are no buttons yet, but I was really dying to try, and it's a nice fit actually.
So we are done now. I hope you enjoyed to stitch the shirt together with me, and I had a nice time. I hope it wasn't too fast. I hope you could follow everything very well. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I hope it gives you like a little bit of a better idea how to assemble a shirt. I hope this is giving you like an idea how to do your own work much better and much more efficiently. Thank you so much for watching. I hope these videos give you like a weekly little break from the COVID crisis. It's my pleasure really to prepare this content for you guys, and it's for me also like a new experience. So hope to see you soon. Anyway, bye bye everyone, and see you next time.